Buckle up, nerds. It's time for the Energy Nerd Show. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Jeannie.
Here we go. The Energy Nerd Show is like camping on an island in Maine, except this camping is where the earth and the sky and the water all come together with the wind and the hurricanes and nature. And the Energy Nerd Show is just the show. Who's our guest today on the Energy Nerd Show?
Today we have Dr. Bonnie Pratt, who recently received her PhD, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. She's also a serial entrepreneur. She's got her MBA, and it's really exciting to have you here. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi.
Morning, Dr. Pratt.
Oh, good morning.
So you sent us a really interesting graph with, I think, really a lot of variables that you put together. Can you tell us about your assumptions?
I guess my research question and the assumptions that flowed from that were what makes utilities more likely to lean into the energy system transition and to talk about renewables and actually to integrate renewables into their supply portfolio. I assumed that there might be some factors sort of at the environmental level, like policies or the rurality of the state, that there might be some factors at the organizational level, for example, the ownership structure of the utility, its size, its age, that type of thing, or even at the managerial level that might influence a utility's willingness and interest to dive into the energy transition.
So do you find that there's a pretty wide range of utilities who are leaning in and who aren't?
Yes, I do. And I think that it's really important that utilities do lean in because they really are the gatekeepers to experimenting with these new technologies and getting them out there.
If a utility is hostile to a particular technology, then it's pretty much not going to happen in certain areas or situations.
Well, I think the change is also hard for utilities because they're used to a guaranteed rate of return, and that's been rather nice. And things are changing pretty dramatically. So I think there is some resistance to that among certain utilities. And it's certainly understandable, but it's also concerning.
So can you tell us the list of some of the factors that you looked at and which ones panned out to look significant?
Well, I studied two dependent variables. So one of them was how much utilities talk about renewables in their integrated resource plans, and the other piece was the actual percent power that utility derives from renewables in their fuel mix. So if we're talking about percent power from renewables, what factors that ultimately ended up influencing that at the environmental level, whether or not the state was deregulated, that actually ended up being pretty significant. Also, it turns out investor-owned utilities are much less likely to have renewables in their portfolio as a percentage of their overall energy supply, and also CEO tenure. So the longer that a manager has been in the power industry, the less likely that utility is to be deriving power from renewables.
Do you have ideas about how those mechanisms might be working? Is it correlation or causation? Can you sort that out? How would we think about that as a possible mechanism or something we might try to fix?
I think that's a great question that a lot of people are wrestling right now. For example, ownership structure, especially I think the case out in California with PG&E going bankrupt, there was quite a bit of dialogue around whether or not it would make sense for that utility to split into co-ops or munis. I think munis was more where the conversation was going versus having, sort of fixing that investor-owned utility. So I think there's been a lot of conversation. There's something to be said for a small, nimble organization that can be more responsive. Municipal utilities are also been very willing to work with entrepreneurs. There's been some great examples of SMUD, for example, just really lending a helping hand to some new entrepreneurs and helping technologies get off the ground. There's been some research about how different utility sizes tend to sort of be more interested in supporting entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it sounds like maybe old school CEOs who have been at it for a long time are less open to change.
That was a finding. And it turns out that trend is not just unique to the power industry, that's found elsewhere as well. Nobody that I could find actually specifically looked at it in the power industry, but it makes sense that these CEOs are comfortable. They've always done things the same way. They're more likely to want to keep doing what they're good at versus really change things dramatically.
And utilities aren't really known for innovation in any case.
No.
That's true.
Right. Well, I mean, that used and useful clause, I think, is really punitive. That if like they invest and take a risk and try a new technology and it doesn't actually end up panning out, that they can't pay for it and they can't get that rate of return on it is really tough. So I think that the system definitely makes it hard for utilities to be more risk tolerant. But certainly the culture of a guaranteed rate of return
Does not incentivize innovation.
yeah, they haven't really needed to. Things have been lovely. And so I think that new times create new challenges and everyone's sort of reacting differently to that.
Were there any results that surprised you?
Yes, there was a really interesting interaction effect between rurality and deregulation that I really want to wrap my head around more because it was really strong and powerful. And what it seems like is that in deregulated states that are very rural, they're far less likely to get power from renewables and to even talk about renewables. So I think that in deregulated states, utilities are more responsive to customer wants and desires because they need to be, because they're competing with one another. My concern is that rural states aren't really enjoying the benefits of renewables in the way that we had hoped that they might. So there was a lot of talk about new jobs and more affordable and more reliable energy, but it appears that in reality, the way that ownership of renewables is structured right now and that decision-making process is going, concerns around siting have really become more prominent than sort of the benefits. And the negative aspects are perhaps a little bit more visible to some of these rural stakeholders. And that to me makes me want to sort of dig more deeply into that and understand if there's something about the way that renewables are owned or that decisions are made about renewables that could be changed or modified in a way to better meet the needs of rural populations who often have really high fuel costs relative to their overall cost because they travel long distances. And they are very interested in reliability and resiliency because they're often out in the middle of nowhere and want to be able to stay warm in cold winters. So that's an interesting question that I'd love to dig more into.
I hope you get the chance. One state that kind of jumps out at me in general is Iowa. You know, you might not expect it to have so much wind generation. And then you kind of look at the history and fairly recent history. And it's just like, wow, it seems like they figured something out in terms of developing wind.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The states that have seen a big increase in renewables really changes the story dramatically. And the way that folks react to that, I think, is interesting as well.
So you said earlier that you had two dependent variables that you were looking at, how much they're talking about, you know, the language of renewables in the IRPs and the renewables in the mix, in the resource mix. How do those two relate as variables? Do utilities that have more talk more?
It's interesting and not what I would expect. So this is another place where I'd really like to dig in more closely. So what I did is I did a simultaneous equation estimation where basically I try to understand how the percent power from renewables influences the sustainability orientation. So do utilities that have more renewables talk more about them in their integrated resource plans? And the answer was a vehement no. which didn't make sense to me. And I think that I've thought a lot about it clearly. And one of my theories is that potentially utilities that are already doing really well in terms of getting power from renewables aren't talking about it because they've sort of made the leap. But it certainly was a surprising result that I didn't expect. And the opposite isn't true. So when you're trying to predict percent power from renewables, it doesn't matter how much they talk about it. That's actually not significant.
Those sound like testable hypotheses for another PhD or.
Yeah, there's certainly different levels of nuance that would be interesting to explore as well. I mean, the example you brought up with Iowa talks about a lot of wind, right? And so I think that when you talk about percent power from renewables, that might be, the utility might get 100% power from renewables or a high percentage, not because they're like deeply excited about being part of the energy transition, but because a hydro plant is in their backyard, right? Or a huge amount of wind that was already installed. And so that doesn't necessarily speak to the culture at the firm. That sort of speaks to existing infrastructure and what's already there.
How did you count hydroelectric power? Was that in your renewable mix?
It is, although I actually have two different dependent variables and I had too much research, so I couldn't sort of consolidate it all. But I had percent power from renewables, and then I also had another variable that I collected, which was percent power from non-hydro renewables. So I did separate that out. So that would be a really cool future direction to see
I think a lot of the hydro might be 100 years old. And so the idea that it doesn't reflect the current culture of the firm, but
Right. And it also doesn't really reflect that sort of more distributed, decentralized vision that at least I'm optimistic will sort of be perhaps not immediate, but a long-term future. So I think that would be another direction to sort of refine the results a little bit more and ask more precise questions. What drives distributed renewable energy generation and not just what drives any renewable energy generation. I think that rurality piece is particularly interesting to me because for me, my vision for the energy transition is not just a switch in technology, but it's actually very much about social decentralization and sort of decentralizing existing power structures and energy democracy. So these results about rurality did really concern me, that citizens that maybe are a little bit marginalized already are seeing negative results from the way that we're installing renewables now. So I feel like that's very important and very close to my heart. So I would love to specifically look more closely into that. I was actually pursuing a postdoc for that as well, but wasn't able to find funding.
thanks for being on the show and sharing this with us.
Oh, thank you. And let me know if you have any research questions, because now that I have these dependent variables, what's been really fun is to plug new things in, like political orientation or net metering. So different independent variables that I didn't apply, but that might actually tell an interesting story about what makes utilities more likely to lean into the energy transition.
I'd like to see a variable for the regulatory commission. There's got to be some measure of the regulators, how they think, and whether or not that influences the utility. I think they're key, but it's also complicated.
That would be really interesting. We could do some type of linguistic analysis like I did on the integrated resource plan, where I sort of looked for words. I didn't even actually talk about entrepreneurial orientation here, which was sort of the seed of the idea for this, which is looking for how I actually dug into the integrated resource plans, was looking at these public-facing documents, which is a well-documented technique for studying entrepreneurial orientation, which is understanding how innovative, proactive, and risk-taking a firm is. That was sort of the nexus of the idea, is I wanted to just apply that to utilities and see who was more innovative and, see if this actually worked on IRPs. And then I sort of took a step beyond that when I wanted to know more specifically about renewables. So not just language on proactiveness in general. And actually that was another very significant result here, is that entrepreneurial orientation really does drive both how much utilities talk about renewables and also how much they implement them. So if there is a public-facing document that regulators put forth, then that would be one that we could sort of look for words that are either entrepreneurial or talking about renewables. And that might be an interesting way to create sort of a measurement system for different regulators and then have a new dependent variable.
Regulators' orders are all public, right? So there's a vast set of documents, mostly online and centrally accessible, but not entirely.
Yeah, we probably want to try to find one that's consistent across multiple states, and then that'd be fun.
Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
It's great talking with you.
Bye.
See you. Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there,
And check
or there, or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where
Yeah,
else?
and the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.